It's really nice to be with you, and I really feel privileged and honored to share the floor with so many interesting lecturers from all around Europe and the world. Just a note at the beginning, I am a philosopher per se, meaning that maybe my way of approaching this topic may differ a little bit from a traditional theological way. So there will be at least two names that I will mention that are actually philosophers, but I consider them very relevant also for the theologians and believers likewise. Being a philosopher, that means that I often tend to think with questions. So I don't think about, I do not intend in as much in providing answers in as much as I think about questions and how deep these questions are and where these questions can lead us. So there will be lots of different questions, and even I end with questions because I would really love to engage with you and to then maybe at the end to really deepen our conversation together. As Raman mentioned, I'm a minority in different ways. I'm an ethnic and religious minority. As I used the word in this presentation, that is at the margins, I often feel like I'm at the margins. So I introduce also this perspective of being somebody on the margins into my research. And I often wondered how would I have felt if I have not met in my life, for instance, somebody like Dr. Peter Kuzmic. Because my former dean, who has now retired, he has also been a minority for all his life. But the way that he has positioned himself in the Croatian society and the way he represented our church in the times of peace, and especially during the times of the war, really affected also the way how I feel today. So that is where my whole story actually starts. It starts with the stories that I learn, and I would not have learned about him nor my school where I came 20 years ago if I did not hear the stories. So my interest is, as this presentation says, about the stories. And I will now share my screen so that you can see the presentation. And these are the key points from where I will start. I don't know how you feel about stories themselves. I know that nowadays they are very often present in what we tend to see as a development in the social theory. My interest about stories, and I will come back to the presentation, came with my first visit to Norway. That was in 1996. Those were the intensive 3 months in which people from former Yugoslavia gathered at one place in Norway to discuss the possible outcomes of then the Dayton Peace Agreement that was just installed like 6 months before we met. And then what happened is that on one of those presentations, somebody in the group, one of the professors, mentioned Bulgaria. And to Macedonians, Bulgaria is, well, a special country in many ways. We have, well, not so beautiful relations in the past and not even so beautiful relations today. They have been conquerors in many times of the territories that are today known as Macedonia, and they still negate the language and the identity of the Macedonian people. So what happened then is that immediately after that professor just said something about Bulgaria and how we are similar, I just snapped. And I just snapped in such a way that I caught myself standing in between the whole group and yelling things like, we are different, our languages are different, our ethnicities are different, they have been conquerors, they have been doing bad things, etc., etc. So not that that is not true, but what was surprising for me was the level of intensity, because what I was referring in basically happened around 1940s. And I was jumping like that in 1996. So I was intrigued why these emotions are so high. And then I knew that I am touched deeply by the situation, by the disintegration of former Yugoslavia, that the war that was happening on the doorsteps of Macedonia, and in which my former country disintegrated, and the horrible things of that war really made a deep impact on me and made me rethink also the memories of the previous wars to which I haven't even witnessed. So that is how I started being intrigued what is going on with the stories, because in my head I not only see the films that I watched and some of the things that I read in the history textbooks, but I also heard in my head the stories of my relatives talking about the ancestors and their horrible experience of those years. So the key point of my presentation thus, and I will now go back to sharing the screen, as you see, are stories. And I use two words for them, and I use them as synonyms, tales and stories. I'm fully aware that they differentiate if we talk about tales that involve invented characters. But nevertheless, they are the same in a sense that they involve a temporal chain of interrelated events. Actions that are taken by certain characters. And both serve to identify the person, or even more so, they both serve for the identity formation even of the whole groups. So the classical stories usually are, I'm just now, making a little bit of a fun with the classical stories. The wolf is bad, the hero has to kill, and the end matters. I now also think in parallel ways how our story of the good news actually matters, and how the hero Christ died for us all, and how the end actually is victorious because Christ has resurrected and he is alive. So in that sense, and that is how this whole presentation will unfold, the storytelling matters. The tales and stories shape our identities. And then for the end, I will talk a little bit more about better stories for better worlds. This is the structure that I will use. I will not go through this structure, and it's not so important to be really seriously part of the conversation. You can read it yourselves. What I will just focus is that I will present some of my own personal insights. I will go to two theoretical or to the two theoreticians. One is René Girard and the other one is Michel Foucault. And I will also tell you a little bit about the two cities that serve as the basis for my case study. These are the Osijek and Vukovar. So, telling the tale. Well, are there universal words for all times, for all messages, and for all audiences? My guess is that we all say no. Are there right words for right time? My guess is that we will say yes. But then again, it's easy to agree to this line, but then when you start to, use words in contemporary situations, those words become tricky. For instance, I had the other day a conversation with Taras, and I asked him a simple question. I asked him, are you okay? The moment I asked this question, I regret it a little bit, because I used the word, that is the word okay, which I use often with my friends, and I expect a sincere, honest answer. Sometimes they told me, I'm not okay. But the moment I regret it was that that word actually means something much more deep or much more outside of the scope of everyday's understanding of okay in Ukraine now. How can somebody respond to "Are you okay?" if that somebody waits to hear from his son who is at the battlefield somewhere? So there are words which are common words, and they really sound in different way in different times. One of those words, and I will now go back to the presentation again, is a very tricky word for Croatians. I don't know whether that is the case in Ukraine, you will tell me that. But for Croatians, the word reconciliation is very difficult. For Croatians, the politics of the war and the post-war is a politics of reconciliation. And that word is troublesome for both the Croats and the Bosniaks and the Serbs, because it means or refers to renewing the relationships, overcoming enmity, reaching accord with somebody that has done you harm in one way or another. So the paradox is clear. In a society emerging from war with elements of civil war, conflict, and violence, often people who are asked to do more than anyone else for reconciliation are the ones who have already lost the most. So I wonder, is reconciliation and the most accurate term, because the question is whether Serbs and Croats really reconciled, met in a proper sense of that word, besides the bare meetings on a political level. And of course, we can say that throughout the 50 years of being together in one common country, they did. But were there stories that were not told between the two of them? Were these stories that were not told, things that were not shared about the Ustashas and the Chetniks, or the whatever forces that were fighting against one another during the Second World War and before that? Were these stories neglected by a political or other decisions? And what is the influence of the neglect of these stories? On the other side, I would dare to say that I'm part of a network where a true story has been told or shared. I have been part of this network for the last maybe year and so. And the meetings of this group, which are 15 of us from all around the world, happened by sharing a story, and not any story, not a story of who we are in terms of a position, who's holding what kind of a position or what kind of achievement in life, but about our places. Where do we come from? Where we work? Who are our families? And that is how the whole meeting or gathering of this network started to unfold. The first time we really met each other was in North Carolina this May. That was actually the very first time, not only when I met these people in person, but I had the privilege to hear what they do for their lives. And they are quite an astonishing group of people. So there are tales of rivalry, which are usually used by the structures of power, who call to our mind a false Eden, an imaginary Eden where everything is so harmonious that nothing wrong can happen. And this kind of images then are pushing us into defending, fighting, for renewing this kind of a state, or viewing one another through a very strict lenses, often separating us from the gifts, from the peace, from the resources, from each other. And there are tales of humanity, or better stories for a better world. But I will come back to this last point later. These are two sides, or the two stories, or the two things which can happen when you're researching stories. I'm sure that you are familiar with these books, especially with the Psychology of Masses by Gustave Le Bon. It is one of the books which really seriously, I would dare to say, stereotype whatever the right word is, puts in stereotypes the masses and the mechanism for managing the masses in war and in conflict and afterwards. This one, which is as an image presented here, The Humankind, A Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman, is a newer book. And it's a very interesting book. And I would recommend that you read it because it's really easy to read. It's not a philosophical book. It's written by a journalist, and it really provides a different story about the humankind. So when I was thinking about the tales in the stories, I also wanted to show you what are my tales. I grew up with the Brother Grimm, and I didn't like them. I don't like them even today, and I never read them to my son. They are scary tales. Brother Grimm are really scary people. I was happy enough or lucky enough to grow up in former Yugoslavia, where we could have an access to also different kinds of stories. And these are some of the stories that I loved. Three Bananas are by Czech authors Zdeněk Slabý. Even there is an animated film about this whole story about the boy called Peter and the Three Bananas. Amazing story, beautiful animated film. The Master Cat, or The Cat in Boots by Charles Perrault. I'm sure that you know that story. And of course, The Little Prince. One interesting thing which I have discovered, I have not researched that, so I don't know what is behind, but this is just like a curiosity. Most of Croatian tales, the contemporary Croatian tales, written late 19th century, early 20th century, so when the Croatia was building up itself as a country during the period of nation building, are written by a woman, Ivana Brlić-Mažuranić. Most Serbian tales, on the other hand, are written by a man, Vuk Karadžić. I have some ideas about what that can mean, but they are not confirmed ideas, so I will not go into details now about it. But I want you to think, what are your tales? What are the tales that shaped you? And what are the tales that you're sharing with your children? Now, going back to the mimetic theory of René Girard. This is a very interesting theory that actually has a lot to do with telling stories. In brief, Girardian theory has been presented in his famous book from 1972, Violence and the Sacred. And his basic thesis is that we learn by imitation, meaning that our desires are not individual, but collective or social. So his claims might be, let's say, simplified for the matter of this lecture like this. After our basic needs are satisfied, food, sex, shelter, safety, people move into the realm of a desire in which there isn't a biological radar or instinct to guide us. Instead, our radar becomes other people. People want what other people want, or desire is social. When mimetic contagion has spread throughout the community, it leads to chaos. So, I'm sorry, I just turned a wrong page. So what is happening is that we tend to choose or to seek for a scapegoat for our wrongs. And the scapegoat can be an individual, a problem, or a group. And we tend to ostracize this scapegoat or to deal with it in a violent way. The cover-up comes later when the conflict is gone. And the cover-up usually comes like a myth-making, recreating the history, imposing laws to sanction the wrongdoers or to prevent repetitive violence and so on. And these are some of the mechanisms that Croatia has actually been through in these years after the war, now almost 30 years after the war. There is another theory which is also very interesting, and I will use both of these theories as we will go to the case study of Vukovar, and that is Michel Foucault and his theory of heterotopia. His theory of heterotopia is interesting because in this theory he actually talks about how not only that war is continuous and perpetual, but also peace is. And that the power has not always negative connotations, that power can be exercised by a variety of groups and peoples, even on the margins at very awkward places. So other places, other spaces, other narratives can also take part in the power and can also use their power to contribute to the society. In that sense, heterotopia is a space where multiple layers of meaning come together and reveal tensions. In Foucault's words, heterotopia's places are jails, how do you call that, psychiatry homes where people are taken in, hospitals of different kinds, but also museums, especially war museums. And now we come to a very specific part of my research, where I go to the museums of war, and I see how museums of war as places of heterotopia shape our stories. This is Vukovar during or when it fell. This is how the city looked like. It was totally destroyed. It fell after 3 months of very serious battles. It fell on November 18th. Immediately afterwards, it was conquered by the Serbian military and paramilitary forces. What happened in the post-occupation events is mass killings, executions, torture, sexual abuse, concentration camps, ethnic cleansing, looting. Vukovar was reintegrated in Croatia in 1998, so 7 years after it fell down. So how that city looks today? Today, the city has been restored, but the whole city is like a city which promotes not only, well, let me use the term dark tourism. You can feel on every single corner the hyper presence of war. But what was the most striking for me when I visited the key archive or the key museum of the Homeland War is that they have developed a special education program for the 8th graders, which actually includes that children of elementary school, 8th grade, they walk the stations of war around the city. And that is a real embodied experience of the war. When Sandra Cvikic researched what the children are experiencing, she noticed the difference between the formal language of the adults as they are describing their experience in Vukovar in the questionnaires she used versus the emotional language of the children. And children used the following words: scared, threatened, empathy, victorious, hurting, proud, impressed, feeling mixed feelings of anger and pride, thankfulness, disbelief, shocked. In my research, I discovered that once you are at that place, and that museum of war is a real place of heterotopia, your body feels like an archive. You are filled with both emotions and sensory affections of all kind on your body. You are also filled with information in your mind, and there is no place where you can really sit down and reflect about everything that you saw. And when I asked the curators, is there a place where the children can be gathered after visiting of this museum to relieve themselves, to talk about what they felt and how they now see the Homeland War? They said that they don't have that sort of a point on that stations of the war. And I thought, how about other stories? How about the stories of the ordinary people of Vukovar who were living there and who have experienced, some experienced atrocities, others had other experiences of helping each other? Where are those stories? Not that the stories of the first ones does not matter. It's just that sometimes having two voices, three voices in one story can enrich the whole picture that we get about the Homeland War, if not for us, but for our children. Because my key question was, what kind of a children we are actually raising up in Croatia? For what? This is how the museum looks like. So you can see variety of things inside. And these are the two most scary things that I've seen. The plane is not scary itself. They use VR, and then you can have the feeling like you are flying over Vukovar, and you can see how the city was burning and how the defenders were helping the people on the ground by sending them some food. But this second one, this is an image of the concentration camp, and the sculptures here are made of metal, and they present the position in which the captives were forced to stay when the soldiers or the paramilitaries would come to the camp. What the curator said is that they are often asking the children to try the pose. So to try and to lean on that wall and to try it. And that was for me shocking, because that is how somebody else's experience becomes internalized as a totally embedded into my body experience of today. So only 36 kilometers of Osijek, of Vukovar is Osijek, is my city where I live now. And Osijek by itself can be also considered as a place of heterotopia, because Osijek was attacked, but it never folded. Unfortunately, luckily, it never fell. So it was a city that was surrounded, but never conquered. That position of being under attack, but not really falling into the hands of the enemy, strengthened different voices in the city. So we had defense forces who are fighting around the city of Osijek on different borderlines, but we also had others who tried to work and live together. So there were numerous believers across religious lines that were starting to work together even as early as 1991. And they were joining forces with non-religious actors. There were concerts with artists, different kinds of events that were ecumenical, interfaith events that were organized in the city in a way or with an aim that the people were actually trying to think beyond the limits of the war. They felt like whatever is happening on the borderlines, in as much that is close, that is limiting them and putting them into a situation in which they felt captives themselves. They wanted to go out of this position, and they wanted to explore the ways how they can help themselves, but also thinking about how they can build the future for the children. The role of the Evangelical Theological Seminary is immense. Not only that this place was the place of a minority religion, ethnically mixed, well-connected, independent from the state, which also, interestingly, provided the space for the Evangelical Theological Seminary to somehow divide itself from the main story, from the story of being a Croat under the attack. It also provided our dean and some other colleagues to do high-level, mid-level diplomacy and lots of grassroots activists that were actually supporting the Croatian efforts towards freedom. They were not sabotaging it. They were supporting Croatian actions for independent state, but at the same time, they were really trying to take care also about other ethnic groups, because Osijek is a city of 20 ethnicities. This is just one example of what was going on. As early as 1991, there was infamous conference in Osijek, and around, I think, 80-something theologians have signed this declaration of Osijek for freedom and justice. This is just an example of the kind of letters that my dean was sending around, and he was receiving from the states and the other countries fighting for the recognition of Croatia as an independent state. So this is toward the end. I'm going back to the idea of better stories. I'm inspired by Gareth Higgins, and he is one of the guys that I've met in the States when I was in May, when I was there. And he is a great storyteller. He's from Ireland. And he said that if we are trying to envision a better world, then we need better stories. So these are my thoughts. If, following Foucault, we can view contemporary wars as the ones who are not really ending, as the ones who are just continuous over time. And if we view peace at the same time as a continuous effort over time. So removing war from our life should be a continuous process. And this is my thesis. It requires education. It requires creating educators, those who think, those who hope, who teach others, and who act. But the questions remain: how to remember rightly? Is there a difference between the ways we remember during the war and the ways we remember afterwards? Are there sacred and not so sacred memories, and how to distinguish between these two? What kind of stories and what kind of places do we need to create to advance peace as a continuous process? So these are the questions that I'm struggling with. I have some of my answers, but I would also love to hear your answers and your views on all of these issues. At the end, I would just like to show you the key resources that I used for this presentation. I used also some other resources for my PhD, but if you're interested, I will mail them to you, so contact me via email. It's difficult. The situation in which you are now, it's very complex and it's very difficult. And it's not easy for the people. And some are more bitter, some are less. Those that are very bitter are very difficult to be dealt with because they don't know how themselves actually to deal with their own anger. I don't know how to really approach them. One way is to check whether their bitterness is related to the sadness or to the aggression. If it is related to the sadness, then the approach is easier. Then you can approach from that aspect of just letting them talk and understanding the sadness. But if the aggression is behind, then it's really difficult, and there will be moment of time in which you will need to protect yourself from all the aggression around, because you also live in a society that is under constant threat. So the aggression is all around. So to shut down and sometimes to get away from these people can be a way out. I don't have a universal answer, but from time to time for the people in Ukraine might be good if you can go out at least for a certain period of time and then come back. It's easier when the war will stop. It will be easier, but the bitter people will continue to be around. Even now, 30 years after the war, there are many bitter people in Croatia. And sometimes it does not have to do with the suffering that they had. Sometimes I even think that the most bitter ones are not those who suffered a lot, but those who suffered maybe not so much. I don't know why that is really happening, but those who suffered a lot, they sometimes find mechanisms to really grow into a people of a deep respect. The others, well, I don't know. There should be other institutions involved and other kind of people involved to help them if they want to be helped. Otherwise, those voices will be always around. And what I sometimes tend to do is I just continue. I just continue with what I do. I continue with those people that fill me in. I continue working what I love, what makes me happy, and I continue because I really trust God that He is the Christ who died for us all, and that the way to proceed is not by only looking to His suffering, but also looking to the hope He gave at the cross, and that is filling me in. Thank you for sharing about the Bogomils and the research that you're doing. It is a very interesting topic. And yeah, Macedonian Bulgarian relations are complex and they're not simple and easy, but I think that there are now different voices coming forth. And I'm looking very much forward to these different voices. About the memory policy, I'm not so sure how whether common memory might help, because we had common memory. Former Yugoslavia was built on a common memory. It was built on unification, on a brotherhood idea that supposed to put under the carpet, as we say, all the differences. Sometimes I think that it's good when we have all these voices coming forth. So the different story of the Serbs about Vukovar and the different stories of the Croats about the Vukovar, both are relevant and both have to be heard. So I think that more spaces of, to use Foucault's word, heterotopia, more spaces of different voices have to happen after the war. If we really want to, if the aim is for the Croatia, to build up a Croatian democratic state that includes national minorities in it with a due respect. If that is not the politics of Croatia, well, then we'll see what will happen. In my experience, the policy of Croatia is going toward the European Union and sharing these values. And the Croatian state really does a lot on the Serbo-Croatian relations. I would even dare to say much more than the Serbian state currently is doing towards Croatia. But there should be more meaningful meetings, not only political meetings on a political level. That's one level. There should be more meaningful meetings, and the meaningful meetings on the other levels where sharing stories can occur. And museums are perfect places of heterotopia where different voices can be heard and can be processed in a scientific way, in an accurate way, so that not all the voices will create a chaos, but the voices of relevance to be included inside. Because these museums actually play an amazing role, and these museums are important. You touched upon one of the most difficult issues in the theory of memory, and that is also the question that Miroslav Volf tackles with in his book, The End of the Memory. When should we stop remembering? It's on one hand side, and as the first question was, just hearing these voices of constantly repeating about the atrocities and the anger and things like that can be very tense, and you wonder why they continue to live blocked in that bubble of being a constant victim. So on one hand, we may ask that question, and that is a very relevant question. On the other hand, if the victimhood has not been dealt in a proper way, if the victimhood has not been satisfied in a proper way by legal mechanisms, by persecuting those who have committed crimes, and when victimhood is supported by the actual politics, in Bosnia on all three sides. So Serbs use the same politics, and they create themselves as the victims because Srebrenica never happened, whatever was there, it is not their fault, etc., etc. And they are victims of the international politics that is putting the blame on them. Croats are victims for the Vukovar, and they are victims also in Bosnia. Bosniaks are victims. So politics uses these mechanisms all the time. And they're using these mechanisms to perpetuate the very simplified pro and contra view on the reality, because that is the way then the mimetic desire continues. Then we are blocked into that circle to imitate that desire, and wanting or not wanting, our children start to imitate that desire of remaining victims and in that image of victimhood. Well, how to get out of it? One way of getting out of it certainly is at the point in which there is a conscious decision not to continue feeling like that if you are a secular. But if you are a believer, that is where Miroslav Volf and the others propose that we really turn our eyes to Christ. And we see that the ultimate victim is already there. And that ultimate victim is walking with us. And it's not making us victims who can be easily manipulated. It's making us somebody who is walking with him. And we can find our strength to be different with him. So there are different ways how we can develop or get out of this victim circle. And one of the ways is certainly through a different kind of education that goes through different storytelling, a storytelling of humanity, storytelling of really seeing the other one through the eyes of the Christ. Of course that we cannot do that at all times. And there are different times in which when our house is under attack, we cannot really do that. But there will be times, and my true prayer for Ukraine is that the war will finally stop, and that you will take a big breath, and that you will have the freedom in which you will be able to think back about everything that happened, and about what kind of stories you would like now to draw out of this very ugly experience, but what kind of stories you will draw out of it, and what kind of stories you will give to your children to be better. Ricoeur, famous French philosopher, has also a very good book about memory. So I totally advise that you check that book. In that book, he also talks about the power of forgetting and letting go, and what are the times in which we really have to forget and let go. Ooh, great question again. It's not naive. It's a beautiful question. There are debates in Croatia about that, because this is again my naivety towards your situation, but my guess is that as you have a Russian minority living in certain territories of Ukraine, where they are not actually a minority, but maybe they are a majority on that territory. That is the case also with Croatia. So during the war, we had the pockets of Croatia where the Serbian minority was actually a majority. So when you have a majority of the population that is military equipped by a foreign force coming into your country, then the war becomes mixed. So it's not that only you have a foreign intervention, meaning military troops and paramilitaries from another territory getting into your territory, but you also have your own citizens getting weapons in hands and starting to join these forces and create small paramilitary groups and actually do rebellious activities of different kind that resemble to a civil war. So the war in Croatia can be said that it was twofold, or at least twofold. And thus the resolution of that war was again manifold. So on one level, it was the military intervention of the Croatian forces, then joined by NATO to resolve the situation on these pockets of territories, as well as their peace interventions, again, in combination of foreign and local forces to try to set a peace agreement so that that military intervention does not spread over the whole territory of Croatia. For instance, the eastern territory of Croatia, where I am now, has been spared of the military intervention of the Croatian forces in terms of cleaning the territory and pushing back Serbs. It was spared. Thus, we got Vukovar back so late in 1998 and some of the other territories far east. But the peace agreement was signed in 1996, and it really brought peace with in sequences or in steps. So it was complex. And my guess is that due to the complexity of the situation in Ukraine, there will be also a variety of mechanisms that will be used also to help Ukraine not only to win the war, but also to set its own boundaries, to strengthen its own borders, and to have its independence to its full. Yes, you're right on both. There was an ethnical struggle even before, but that ethnical struggle was related to the nation building of both states and to the development of the nations, the Serbian nation and the Croatian nations in 19th and 20th century. It is also related to the former atrocities between these two countries and these two people. There have been several occasions, even prior to the First World War, during the First World War and Second World War, where these two groups were in conflict. About the colonizers, yes. For instance, what is interesting, when I did these 25 interviews, in-depth interviews, whenever I would talk to Croats, they would refer to these territories, which were mixed territories, but let's say that majority were Serbs in them, but were mixed territories. They would refer to these territories that were conquered by the Serbs as territories conquered by the Serbs. And territories colonized once upon in a time by movement of the purposeful movement and settlement of Serbian people on these territories by the politics of the then kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. When I spoke to Serbs about it, they would never refer to these territories as territories that were conquered, but they would refer to these territories as territories under the Serbian rule. So even the wording for what is going on in Vukovar or in Baranja differs. So how would Serbs depict the rule of the Serbian authorities in Vukovar will be different than how the Croats will depict what happened in Vukovar. So the words matter as they reflect also the memory, and out of those memories that we have, we then also create stories that we transmit to our children. For instance, I spoke yesterday with with a poet from Macedonia, and he shared with me one story that was to me very, well, interesting. He said that he was shared the story from his grandfather that his grandfather was fighting against the Turks, and he had two knives in his hands, and he was approaching the Turk guy, and the Turkish guy had a sword. And of course, with this sword, the Turkish guy cut the head of his grandfather. But nevertheless, his grandfather continued fighting, and he managed to kill this Turkish guy with one of the knives. So I was like, scratching a little bit my head about that story. But that story, he said, has an enormous importance in his life, because it is a story about the bravery of his ancestors. And then I added, and how beheaded you are, which in Macedonian means flying around like crazy. So I was trying to make a laugh, not to mock him, but to make a laughter out of that story, so that to show to him a little bit how, well, weird that whole story is, that he keeps as a very precious one to his heart. What I thought when I asked Taras, "Are you okay?" I thought that the better response would be, "How are you, Taras?" Just, "How are you?" It would be difficult for him to respond, as it was difficult for him to say whether he is okay. He said, "Depends how you define okay." But it will be difficult also for him to respond, "How are you?" Because again, we use "How are you?" not in as much to check how somebody really is, but just to ask that question out of politeness. So when I feel like contacting my Ukrainian friends, then I really contact them. And then when I ask, "How are you?" I really wait for the answer on their behalf for a response. So one needs to prepare him herself for that kind of a conversation. Also, it needs just to be open and blunt and say, "I don't know much about whatever is going on in your life. If you would like to share, please share. If you cannot, I understand. Just let me know and I will pray." So what I do from time to time, even when I don't ask these kinds of questions, I send a message of prayer to my brothers and sisters. So that is comforting. I know that my friend from the US, Andrew, he put on a face the other day, he said that he was so sad that day, and that he was just wondering how can he overcome that sadness, and whether there will be somebody, just anybody, sending any sort of message to him, and that he received just a tiny message of prayer. And that really means a lot. And to me, that is what Christ is all about. It's one of the most difficult questions ever, because what I see in Croatia, for instance, even now, 30 years after, it's difficult to talk about forgiveness. Croatians have a saying, can't translate it now properly, but it's like, I forgive, but I remember. To me, these two things are basically the same. If you remember, and if you treasure this memory, and if you treasure this memory as pro and contra, then you haven't forgiven. So you're not ready really to forgive, because to me, forgiving really means that you, at one stage of your life, you let go. But for a true forgiveness to happen again, I think that the process is needed. It cannot be imposed. It simply cannot. Feelings have been hurt, people have been lost. So many wounds in, now I'll speak about Croatia, of course, and then you will think about your own context. But in Croatia, so many things have happened that are not easy. This, even more so for Bosnia. That's why they are still into the victimhood mood. So many bad things happened to the Bosniaks, and even they are happening today. The politics is perpetuating this whole standstill of the situation of not sanctioning in a proper way the wrongdoers. You have politics of Serbia that is actively negating Srebrenica, the biggest mass grave ever discovered after the Holocaust. So it's horrible to me to hear these kind of things, and it's difficult to forget. But if there is honesty on many levels, honesty have to happen on many levels. Honesty in speech first. Honesty how we name things. Do we name things as an invasion, or we name things as enactment, taking back the territories? I mean, what that word means, we are just taking back what was once ours. Well, that what was once yours is no longer yours. So the moment you are taking it back, that is annexation. That is occupation. So the first thing starts with being very honest with the wording, being very honest about the things that were happening on the ground, being honest with persecuting the wrong things that were happening, hearing to the victims, writing down the stories, initiating the justice system to continue working on its own, and of course allowing civil society and religious organizations to start working in between. Well, as Christians, it's quite a challenge for us. It's quite a challenge for us how to, at one point, we are hurt as humans, and how to overcome our humanity and be more Christ-like. I would agree with Roman. There are times in which you simply cannot do that. Maybe it's too hurting, too close. I truly hope that the time will come in which we can come together. In Osijek, this situation started to unfold slowly, by small, tiny initiatives. And it's important that we, as Christians, at least do not judge the people who want to do that kind of things at the forefront, that we do not stop them, prevent them. If they feel that they have to go there and they have to do such a things to encounter the other, well, even if you don't agree, let's not do harm on them. These voices can in the future be very important. These voices can then in the future be the very foundation of coming together again. And I'm sure that there are beautiful voices on the other side, that there are, maybe they are now in a minority, maybe they are suppressed by the Russian regime, maybe they are afraid. I would be afraid of Putin. It's not easy to be there. But there are voices and brothers and sisters who think differently. And there will be time, I hope, that these people will step forward and will come, and the Ukrainians will come. But yeah, now it's difficult. Again, I think that different words, different stories, different activities are very much related to different times. There are times in which certain stories, certain ways that we talk and act can be considered as a betrayal. I know that my dean, Peter Kuzmic, he was under threat for his life because as early as '92, he invited Serbs and Croats to come together at our seminary to talk. And he was under the threat by the Croats. And he was protected by a police for several months. So some people think that they should opt for this kind of activities earlier. Some people think that they should opt for these activities later. What is important for me as a Christian is that we do not use Christ up front to defend evil, or we do not use Christ up front to bless weapons, or we don't use Christ up front to say, I wish bad to the others. To be very careful how we use Christ, how we use our faith, and to always think what is the final aim, what do I really want to achieve the moment I say I'm Christian, the moment I say I'm Christ-like in the situations of war. You are in a very difficult situation. I'm not. And I cannot imagine how torn you feel and how difficult for you must be to be Christian and to see everything going on around you. My only desire is that you do not maybe repeat some of the mistakes that Croatian Serbs did. At one point, Croatian and Serbian religious leaders started blessing the weapons. I think that is the borderline. That is the limit. That is something where I don't see Christ. I see misuse of religion for nation building. And I see that is where I think we should stop. I don't think that I'm the right person for this kind of questions because I'm really not a theologian per se. I'm a philosopher, so I can respond from my philosophy standpoint. But just going back a little bit on Kiev and what was happening there. So I again see similarities between Kiev and Vukovar and Kiev and Osijek, because, for instance, people here were telling me stories that actually the division line between the Serbian armies and the Croatian defenders were just this street here. So those of you that were in Osijek, you know that I'm talking about, a couple of meters from the seminary. So that kind of memories and that kind of feelings make a tremendous impact, not only on, we tend to think that we memorize only in our heads, but our bodies also memorize. So we contain all these memories in our bodies. So our bodies tend to react each time when we pass by buildings in which we see holes, even today in Osijek. We are all pacifists, I would say, but I would not even use the term pacifist. I would say that we are all pro non-violence during the times of peace. But it's difficult to remain non-violent during the times of a war. It's difficult because you at one point need to defend even yourself, or you feel, even if you don't need to defend yourself, you feel threatened. You just feel, just because you watch the news and you hear the relatives and the people around you talking, or you hear the sound of bombs, or you hear the airplanes, you feel threatened. It's difficult to remain non-violent, as we tend to always envision in Christ. We see Christ as the absolute non-violent person. Not in terms that he was not responding. Non-violence does not necessarily mean pacifism. He was not passive. He was pacifist, yes, he was pro-peace, but I would even dare to say he was more a non-violent resistor, because he really found an amazing ways to resist violence and even to show how you can show power towards somebody who has 10, 20, 30 times more power than you have at that very moment. But again, if I compare the situation, maybe Christ was in Osijek. Maybe what was going on in Jerusalem of those days were like it was in Osijek. So he felt under threat, but there were no actual bombs falling around. How he would have reacted if there had been a destruction of Jerusalem taking place at that very moment, as the Jews of the Old Testament experienced, I don't know. I don't really know. I think that our Bible is one book, and that we should not separate the Trinity apart and use it as we wish, but that we really have to be very careful not to inflict or to add to the violence by using the Bible. That is where I would make a line, a stop. I will use the Bible, I will use Christ as a Christian, if I can, to help my brothers and sisters around me, to love them, to nurture them, to help in so many ways that I can, to use his non-violence ways of resistance if I see places where I can use. If I feel threatened, well, I might use other means to protect my own family, the people and friends that I love. But I wouldn't use him nor the Bible to justify greater harm. I was recently at a concert in which the singer at the end of the concert said something like, let's bless the weapons that are now used against the Russians. I wouldn't go there. Well, if I can compare, it's very similar in these 2 points. If you see the disputes of the past, in many instances in the past, Serbian official politics was expansionist politics, and it was such that it denied the existence of Croats, Bosniaks, and Macedonians likewise. All these three nations were considered Serbian nations that falsely became Roman Catholics and thus Croat, Muslims and thus Bosniaks, or they belonged to a pagan Macedonian Orthodox Church. So it's similar. These are the mechanisms how that sort of policies usually work. But you are right. I wouldn't dare to say that whatever was happening in Croatia should be a recipe of what you should or should not do in Ukraine. The situation is different. Your experiences are different. Your past is different. You have different moments in past that in your collective memory form your identity in a way in which it is now. And from that identity which you are creating now, you will have a momentum to build your new identity, or you are actually now building your, if not new, but transformed Ukrainian identity or strengthened Ukrainian identity for the future. So what we can learn from the experiences of the others, and that's where I see the value of the stories, is how what happened impacted me, how what happened has impacted different people. The human experience of suffering, the human experience of dilemmas, of anger, of you name it, is the one that is shared. And that as an experience can be used to foster discussion, or at least to share the message you are not alone. Me, as a Macedonian from Croatia, can understand very little what is going on in Ukraine. If I was a Croat from Vukovar, I am sure that I would have understood even more what you are saying now. So these are the nuances which can help us in building bridges, in understanding, or at least listening to one another. That is why, for instance, the Croatian politics of today is so much pro-Ukrainian politics, because it sees the shared moments and thus the shared understanding of what is happening.